Okay, welcome everybody. I'm sorry we're a few minutes late, but welcome to Flu Science 101. And for all of you who are on Facebook, note that you can ask us questions below the section and where the live stream is going. But maybe we thought we'd sort of introduce ourselves first. So I'm Steve Pergam. I'm an infectious disease physician and clinical researcher, and I work at the Fred Hutch as the Infection Prevention Director at the SCCA and take care of immunocompromised patients. Helen?
My name is Helen Chu. I'm a faculty member at University of Washington. I'm also an infectious disease doctor, and I study vaccines against flu and RSV.
My name is Jesse Bloom. I'm a faculty member here at the Fred Hutch and with the HHMI, and I study the evolution of viruses.
I'm Trevor Bedford. I'm also a faculty member here at the Fred Hutch. Work broadly on genomic epidemiology, things like Ebola, Zika, but with also a particular interest in flu evolution and really trying to forecast how that evolution will proceed.
Okay. If anybody has trouble hearing, make sure to let us know, but hopefully they're double checking the sound to make sure that's good. So maybe I'll start at the end of the table because it's a bit easier for you, Trevor. Sorry, but why were you interested in studying flu in the first place?
Yeah, thank you. So I actually did my PhD in evolutionary biology, and at that time it was all working on fruit flies and yeast and so forth. And then for postdoc 1, I started working on influenza. At that time, it was really interesting from a data. So lots of viruses that are getting genetically sequenced, and so you can watch evolution. And then with these viruses, things happen much more quickly. So basically 10 years of flu evolution is like 1,000,000 years of fruit fly evolution. And we can really kind of watch that evolution unfold. So it was interesting to me from just this basic evolutionary questions of being able to really look at things that we care about in evolution, like adaptation, genetic drift, etc. And then basically what happened is interested from this evolutionary perspective, and then kind of figured out that some of these this evolutionary perspective can actually help with these really applied questions about vaccine strain selection and so forth. And then I've kind of been moving in that direction.
Great. And Jesse?
Yeah, and like Trevor, I really got interested in flu coming really more from the perspective of evolution than public health, although I'm now very interested in the public health questions as well. For my PhD, I was also studying evolution. I was studying the evolution of proteins. I was actually working with Francis Arnold, who in the lab and mutate them to try to evolve them to do interesting things for technological purposes. And I was very interested in this process of how you could make mutations to proteins and help them develop new properties, but I was less interested in the engineering part. So I got very interested in looking at viruses like flu, because unlike the genomes of sort of large organisms like ourselves, which encode a lot of stuff, very little of which is actually making protein, in flu pretty much the entire genome of the virus is making proteins, and most of the really interesting and important evolution, like the evolution that Trevor was talking about, involves changes to these proteins. So I got interested in flu because it was a great system to study sort of how mutations affect proteins, and then since then, like Trevor, I've become very interested in sort of the larger implications of these mutations in the context of the virus and public health.
Great.
And as a physician, my interest was mostly from the patient side, actually. When I was in medical school, I did a lot of work overseas in sub-Saharan Africa, working on viral epidemiology for HIV. And when I came here for my fellowship training, I actually started fellowship during 2009. So I spent a good chunk of fellowship dealing with the consequences of the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. And I remember one of the more vivid memories was taking care of pregnant women in the intensive care unit and watching them die of H1N1 and then seeing their babies have no parents to take care of them. And that was incredibly hard. From my perspective, since I study vaccines, flu is a good one to study because the vaccine changes every year, and we know that vaccines protect you against severe disease and hospitalization. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how giving a vaccine to a pregnant mom protects her and protects her baby.
Great. Remember to ask questions below because that's helpful for us to be able to hopefully address the questions you all have. So I'm similar. I'm a clinician, and for me, it's important because I deal with cancer patients who are the most immunocompromised and are potentially at risk for developing life-threatening flu. While vaccine is important, and I think we really advocate it for cancer patients and those who are immunocompromised, many of them don't respond as well to the vaccine, and so despite getting vaccinated, are not as protected. And when that happens, if they do get flu, the risk is substantial. Despite therapy, many of them can have really adverse consequences. And so one of the goals that we really want to do in our community and nationally is really want to get people aware of how important getting vaccinated is to protect the people around you. The most vulnerable who are in your communities, if you are vaccinated, you can help prevent them from getting influenza. So one of the things that we've sort of taken a bigger role on here is not only just really promoting vaccines locally, but doing more advocacy because we know how important it is. So flu, I think, is an underrated pathogen in many ways. You have 4 different scientists at a cancer center that are focused on it, and at the University of Washington. I think it's really important that flu is something that I think often is expected to be a minor ailment or a minor runny nose or sore throat. It's actually quite severe. So I think it's a good reminder to everyone to get your vaccines. And I can tell you, all of us have had our vaccine and are certainly pro-vaccine all the way, so it's important. So maybe since we're talking about the vaccine, Helen, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about the current vaccines that are available?
Sure. So there's a lot of different vaccines available. The one that most people get is the injectable vaccine. It's called the quadrivalent vaccine, so it contains 4 components to the 4 different types of flu that can cause disease. So there's 2 types of B and then 2 types of A. One is seasonal flu A, which we think of as H3N2, and then the other one is pandemic flu A, which is H1N1. And that's the one the vast majority of people will get. There are other populations who are at higher risk, like older adults, and for those people we recommend that they get a higher dose vaccine called the Highdose Vaccine, which includes a little bit more of the antigen, so the piece of the of flu that stimulates a good immune response. We recommend that they get that because it boosts their immune response a little bit more and protects them. And then this year, the CDC, ACIP actually also recommended that flu mist be used again. And flu mist is the nose spray that for the last few years wasn't very effective in preventing the flu. So now this year you can get the flu mist, or you can get the flu shot, or if you're an older adult, you can get the high dose. Flu mist we don't give to cancer patients because it's a live vaccine, so it can cause disease if you are immunosuppressed.
Jesse, what do you think? I mean, there's been this debate a little bit about cell-based versus egg-based vaccines. Can you talk a little bit about the science behind how the egg-based vaccines, some of the early data, and how that has affected how the virus actually is replicated in that, and how that changes?
So one of to get to Steve's question, most of these really all of these vaccines in the end involve, or except for the certain vaccines, involve growing up large amounts of the virus, and then that virus is in some way, inactivated. In the case of the injectable vaccines, and that's why you're actually getting your immunogen, or the thing that's going to produce the antibodies from. And so you have to produce a lot of this virus. And so the traditional way that this virus has been produced is growing it in eggs, because most flu strains grow very, very well in eggs. So one of the things that's more recently become a problem, particularly with the H3N2 virus, which is, as Helen was just saying, one of the 3 or 4 viruses that's in the vaccine, is that virus no longer grows, in some cases, all that well in eggs. So as Trevor will probably talk about a little bit later, a lot of work by very smart people like Trevor goes to picking which strain of flu we think should be in the vaccine, because we think that's the strain that will be most similar to what's actually out there infecting people. But something that's happened a couple of times recently is in this H3N2 virus, that virus is picked, and then when large amounts of it are grown in the eggs, the virus mutates in a way that helps it grow in the eggs better. And some of those mutations that allow the virus to grow in the egg better change the parts of the virus that our immune system recognizes. So these are so-called egg adaptation mutations. There was some really nice work by Scott Hensley, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, and various other groups, showing that in some cases, people who get the vaccine with this egg-adapted strain will end up mounting a much better immune response to the egg-adapted virus which isn't so helpful because they're not being infected with the egg-adapted virus, they're being infected with the circulating virus. So as Steve was alluding to, there are also other ways you can grow up the virus. You can also grow it up in cells, so these are mammalian cells that are grown in dishes, or actually there are ways that the people can just produce the hemagglutinin protein itself. And both of those, in the case of the cell-based vaccine, reduce, and in the case of the protein-based vaccine, totally eliminate the possibility for these adaptive mutations to happen. And so there's been a lot of work. I would say it's not 100% certain for this particular year. There's been a lot of work to look into whether these cell-based or protein-based vaccines might be better in years when there are egg adaptation mutations.
Yeah, and one advantage I think of the cell-based vaccines too is the amount of time it takes to produce them is substantially less. So there's real advantages from that perspective. So Trevor, I think Jesse alluded to this. Some of the choices in how we choose vaccines is really, I think for many people, it's sort of a dark box that we don't really understand. And I'd be curious if maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that process happens, because that's an area where you have real expertise.
So this whole system is managed by the World Health Organization, so often I'm saying the WHO, and this has kind of grown up since the early 1970s, where now there is a worldwide apparatus of countries collaborating with each other in kind of an amazing bit of international diplomacy, where viruses from all over the world are collected. So if someone shows up sick in a hospital anywhere in the world, basically, and then occasionally those viruses get swabbed and get sent into WHO collaborating centers. There are 5 of these collaborating centers. One is at the CDC in Atlanta, one is in London, one is in Beijing, one is in Tokyo, and one is in Melbourne. And they each kind of collect viruses from different geographic catchment areas that are kind of countries that they're working with, or national influenza centers that they're working with. And then the collaborating centers genetically sequence the viruses, as well as look at these kind of immunological characteristics. And then so the collaborating centers can get together then, and they get together in late February to make a decision about what vaccine strain to use in the following Northern Hemisphere season. So in this example, there was a meeting in Geneva in February where the collaborating centers and some associated staff from WHO and so forth got together in late February of 2019. And at that point, they're basically looking at viruses mostly that were collected in 2018, because it takes a little while to sequence them and ship them and so forth. And then they make that decision. They only get to pick one out of the many thousands of viruses they have on hand to use for H3N2, one of the many thousands of viruses they have on hand for H1N1, one for BVIC, and one for BYOM. And then, because it takes a long time to basically manufacture the virus and get things distributed and so forth, they're making that decision in late February for kind of a year-long look ahead. So we'll make a late February 2019 decision for a 2019-2020 flu season. And that is quite a challenge because things can change fairly dramatically over the course of these 9 months. And so this is a kind of a persistent challenge to be able to forecast and choose that single virus in best as possible fashion.
That's I think really informative. Thanks. I encourage people to check out nextstrain.com, which is one of .org. I apologize. .org, which is a site that Trevor updates data pretty frequently, and you can see how these viruses change over time. It's fascinating. It has data on seasonal flu as well as other viruses, but a really great place if you want to see the kind of work that goes into some of these decisions. It's really a really amazing site to see. One question that came up from someone online that maybe I'll have you address, and I'll read it to you. It says, I have a baby and I'm already planning on getting the flu shot. Are there any other flu-related vaccines like swine flu, bird flu, whooping cough, etc., that I should get too?
Okay. So this is coming from somebody who already gave birth.
Yep, gave birth, and it sounds like they're planning on getting the flu shot themselves. So
that's
the
great.
newborn protection, which is right up your alley.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we recommend that when you're pregnant, you get both the flu shot and the whooping cough vaccine, which in the United States is called the Tdap. And that protects your baby through antibody transfer to the fetus during pregnancy, and then that antibody in the baby protects them for the first 6 months of life. So most likely you received Tdap during pregnancy, but if you didn't, you are certainly able to get it now, because it'll take about 2 weeks for you to mount a good immune response, but then it'll protect you against pertussis. And then importantly, because the mom is often the person who gives the pertussis to the baby, it also protects your baby from pertussis. And that's really one of the best ways to protect the baby, is to get that vaccine during pregnancy. For flu vaccine, you should receive that during pregnancy. You could also receive it now during during October, because this is actually a great time to get it for this season.
Yeah.
And then if your baby is 6 months old, then they can get the flu vaccine as well. Under 6 months, we do not give flu vaccine to babies. They really rely on that antibody from the mom that they got during pregnancy.
Yeah. Also really important in that context is I always remind people that everyone around you, not just you and the baby, but all the other kids in the household, friends and family that are going to be visiting a newborn, it's really important to get them vaccinated too, because any of those people can be carriers that would potentially put a child at risk. Another question here is a question about the influenza shot. If one has a self-limiting cellulitis or a localized reaction without any other side effects, does this mean that they have not a mounted immune response and will not develop antibodies? I think a lot of times people worry that they didn't get an immune response because they don't have soreness in their arm, or they feel like they have a lot and maybe they're not going to respond well. We don't really completely understand the reactogenicity that an individual has to the benefit. So I think some people say if you have a more robust response, maybe it means you had a better response, but we don't necessarily know that specifically. So I wouldn't look at the reactogenicity you get for a vaccine to know whether it's been effective. So typically that isn't used as a tool for people who are getting the vaccine.
Yeah,
So
most normal healthy adults have a good response to flu vaccine that is protective.
Yeah, that's right. So, maybe a question that's come up that I've heard a little bit about, and I'm curious what you all think is, what's been going on in Australia. So Australia this past year, if for those of you who are not aware, Australia had a really early season. The primary strain of influenza was H3N2. So I'm curious, what do you guys think the links between what's happening in Australia and what will happen here? Do you guys have a sense of what that might look like?
Yeah, so generally, if we look at seasonal flu, and H3N2 in particular, there seems to be continual circulation within southern China, India, Southeast Asia, just because of how seasonality works. So we have a strong winter flu season in the US and Europe and Japan, whereas in, say, Australia, they have a strong winter flu season, but that's obviously June, July, August.
Yeah.
And so because of these strong seasons, that doesn't permit the virus to circulate year-round, whereas in areas with large population sizes that are closer to the tropics, flu can circulate year-round. And so what we generally see is that the strains that eventually make it to Australia and to the US and to Japan and to Europe, they come from this circulation network within southern China, India, Southeast Asia. And so it makes it so that the exact flu viruses that are in Australia last summer, they're not going to make it to the US. So there's not a direct causal relationship between what is circulating in Australia and what arrives in the United States. However, because Australia tends to get viruses also from this East-South Asian circulatory network, then that tends to be kind of the similar viruses that we're going to get when we have the Northern Hemisphere season. And so they're kind of correlated, but they're not causally related. What we saw in Australia this year, again, was a early season that was severe, but not unprecedentedly severe. There seems to be a fair amount of debate still about how much that was reporting bias. So it became kind of early on, people were noticing flu, and then people were actually going to the clinic because they were worried about flu, and so there was kind of more samples coming in than usually in a year. And so it's as far as I can tell, it's still a little unclear of how much was just reporting and how much was an actually really early season.
Yeah, great. So a couple other questions here. Can you comment on flu ad versus high-dose flu vaccine? So It's always a little interesting. I don't know if you have much experience with Fluad. I haven't seen many people use it, but it is the alternate. There is Fluad is the adjuvanted.
Adjuvant.
Oh, okay.
It's the
Yeah.
We don't know these
Yeah.
technical names, but yeah.
Okay.
So the issue is there's 2 vaccines that are actually approved for people 65 and older. One is a high-dose vaccine that's basically, I think it's triple or quadruple the
It's quadruple
the amount of
hemagglutinin.
hemagglutinin. And then Fluad, which is an adjuvanted vaccine. So it is there's an extra component in the vaccine that leads to a more robust immune response. And there's a number of adjuvanted vaccines that are coming through the pipeline at the moment, including Shingrix, which is one that's been used for herpes zoster
What
as an
is the
example.
adjuvant?
I can't remember what the adjuvant is. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But regardless, the Fluad is both of them have been shown in large clinical trials to be effective at better response in people 65 and older. So I think there are potentially some benefits for those of you out there who are looking for it. There has been a shortage of high-dose vaccine this year. They're catching up slowly, but for those who can't find the high-dose vaccine, Fluad can be a potential choice.
And the adjuvanted flu vaccine is a quadrivalent.
Yes, that's correct.
Whereas the high-dose flu
only-
vaccine is a trivalent.
Yeah.
So with the
Yeah.
adjuvanted vaccine, you get a better immune response, and you also get protection against the 4 strains. So there is that advantage. I don't, and maybe this is just because I don't know the literature, but I haven't seen a head-to-head
No,
of
there hasn't
flu
been.
adjuvant versus flu high-dose.
And Fluad in general has been only really used in sort of normal hosts. There hasn't been any immunocompromised patient data yet. Because another question that came up is someone who is myeloma, who has immune deficiencies, should they get a flu vaccine? Should they get a high dose or a standard dose? And should they get maybe another dose? This comes up occasionally. High dose hasn't really been studied a tremendous amount in immunocompromised patients. There's a current clinical trial with Natasha Halassa at Vanderbilt that we're participating in that is completed. Data should be coming out next year that actually looks at our high-risk bone marrow transplant patients and has shown as comparing high-dose vaccine versus a standard vaccine and seeing if that would be beneficial for those high-risk patients. And if that is effective, I think that would be a clue that maybe that would be a better choice for some of these other populations. So
and we
we'll
should
see.
have probably a high-dose quadrivalent shortly.
Yeah,
So
great.
it's available.
Yeah, I think that's hopeful. So, Jesse, I'm curious. Some of the stuff that you've done has been related to intra-host comparisons. So, do you want to talk about some of the work maybe you've done in that space? Because what we're talking about here is sort of global public health components, but some of the work you've done has actually looked at individuals and how flu changes and how the immune response focuses on that specifically.
Yeah, so we've done some work looking at how flu changes actually within infected people, and this work has mostly been done by Helen Chu, who until recently was a graduate student working in my lab. She worked on one of our projects in collaboration with Steve and some of Steve's colleagues as well, and she's now at Stanford. And so Trevor was talking about how flu changes, sort of year to year, and how the virus is evolving, as it goes through, travels around the globe. And you can imagine the virus is not spending the whole year typically infecting one person. Every person has flu for a couple of days, at least if they're not immunocompromised or having some really long-term chronic infection, and then they transmit the virus to someone else. So a really interesting question is how much evolutionary selection is happening within these infected people. We know at some point the viral mutations have to be happening within these people because that's the only place the virus can replicate. So we've looked at this a couple of ways. In one case, a few years ago now, we did a study in collaboration with Steve and some of Steve's colleagues here at the Fred Hutch, and there what we found is that within patients who were immunocompromised and had very, very long flu infections, you could actually see the virus evolving within these patients in a somewhat similar way as you would see it evolving around the globe. So that's sort of an unusual case because those infections were unfortunately going for months, which is not the normal case. So something that Catherine did very recently was sort of look at data generated by other groups, particularly Adam Loring and Emily Martin, who are at University of Michigan, and they'd done very nice sequencing of flu infections from people who had typical short flu. And one of the surprising things they found is that unlike these long infections, you didn't see mutations spreading within people with short infections. And that sort of makes sense because these infections are very short and there's a lot of them. And so what Catherine did is she compared and she looked to see what are the types of mutations that are arising within these infected people versus the types of mutations that are arising as the virus spreads. And what we in fact see is that the number of mutations that occur within an infected patient, if you look at just the mutations that we don't think are affecting the virus, are about at the same rate as the virus is evolving globally. So the mutations that are arising in any given person, they don't seem like they're a lot, but they're about what you'd expect given, how many people the virus infects in any given year. And actually the main thing that transforms those mutations that occur within a person to the things that spread globally is selection against the mutations that are bad for the virus. So you primarily see lots of mutations arising within a host and then mostly purifying selection as you look at longer time frames against those mutations that are deleterious.
Yeah, I encourage people, I've posted this on Twitter, just some of the work that Jesse's group has done, including the new paper that you have done on bioRxiv. It's quite interesting. I also encourage people to look at the paper that Trevor recently posted on bioRxiv about planning for the next season, which is really interesting in terms of thinking about it. One question that always comes up for me, and I think is constantly one that I'm being asked as a clinician, is when should I get my flu shot? One of the reasons I asked this is a question was, if you've already come down with the flu, would you recommend getting vaccinated if that's already happened? I think you can probably speak to this. Yeah.
So remember that the flu shot contains, it protects you against 4 types of flu. Mm-hmm. So if you got flu, you got one of the flus, but you probably didn't get the other 3. So it's still important to get your flu shot because it protects you against the other 3 viruses. The best time, that's really under debate, but the CDC recommends September to October as the months to get flu vaccine. If you get it too early, then your immune response will wane. Mm-hmm. If you get it too late, you may not be protected, and you may not be able to get it.
Yeah, and just to sort of elaborate on what Helen was saying there, obviously, you would want to get the flu vaccine anyway, and you also would want to make sure that, every time you think you had the flu, unless you actually got it molecularly tested, it might not have actually been the flu because there are various other things that can make you feel like you have the flu.
Yeah, right.
And I think, to Helen's point, this is an unfortunate issue with the flu vaccine that's not true of all vaccines. There are some vaccines, for instance, the measles vaccine, where if you get that vaccine, you'll have very high antibody titers, so very high immunity against that virus for a very long time, possibly for the rest of your life. And in the case of flu, that's unfortunately not true, at least with the vaccine. You'll get antibody titers that will sort of go up, and then they'll go back by the end of the season, 9 or 10 months later, they'll be almost as low as they were at the start. So this is a really unfortunate aspect of how the vaccine works right now, and there's actually a lot of groups around the world really working to try to understand ways to make the vaccine give a longer lasting response. But this is the essence of this question that Helen was addressing, is ideally you might want to get the vaccine a couple of months before you're going to get exposed to the virus.
Right.
Unfortunately, none of us know. Unfortunately, none of us know exactly when we're going to be exposed to the virus. So the best you can do is get the vaccine a little bit before we think when the flu season will start, which obviously we don't know for sure.
And I think for all of us, one of the reasons I recommend to a lot of our clinical staff and our research staff who travel around the world to give talks and things like this is that you may be going to an area in an airport or someplace else that actually there is a fair amount spreading. Flu is kind of around all year. It's in certain parts of the world it sort of never stops spreading. So at any point in time around the globe there is flu someplace. So if you're traveling, it is good to be thinking about this, particularly in the United States, around seasonality when you're traveling in Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. Those are times when it's really an opportunity for flu to start spreading. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, like some seasons we start first. That's a couple of seasons ago. We started really early in like November.
By we, you mean
yes,
Seattle?
me meaning Seattle. Yeah. Sorry, good point. Thanks. Seattle, Washington started early, which is really atypical. And I think at the moment, the highest location in the United States that I looked at the last map was like Louisiana, which seems a little bit atypical because normally it's Atlanta or other places where you start seeing it first, but you just never know. And all of our airports are now international airports anymore, so we're getting people traveling all over all the time, and so it's really important to do that. I want to come back to one point you made, Jesse, that's super important, is that people say they have the flu, and what is really the flu is when you have documented flu. There's lots of other infections that circulate around the time the flu does that can be similar. RSV is one that Helen studies really closely, that for older people and for really young kids can be pretty severe and can look and sound a lot like flu. Paraflu can also do the same. You have metapneumovirus. There are other viruses that have similar approaches or similar appearances that the flu vaccine will not protect you from. So if you get a cold, it doesn't mean you have flu. It means you could have something else. Let's see. I'm trying to think of other questions. Other issues that you guys want to bring up this season, and as you're thinking about aspects of flu, things that you find are interesting, new research that is going on in your labs, or other things that you'd like to bring up? Here's a question. Is there a serum-based test to determine efficacy of vaccine response?
Yes. Yeah.
There are things that people measure in the serum. So when you're the very standard assay that's done, and this has been done now for many decades, is when you get the vaccine, you can take serum, which is essentially the liquid component of blood, where there are antibodies, and you can measure how well those antibodies typically do one of two things: either prevent a virus from attaching to cells, that's called the hemagglutination inhibition assay, or actually prevent a virus from infecting cells, that's called the neutralization assay. And there's a lot of evidence that there's reasonable correlations, particularly the more of these neutralizing or hemagglutination inhibition assays you have against the virus, the less likely you are to be infected, and there's a lot of epidemiological data supporting that. But it's certainly not a perfect relationship, and the reasons why it might not be a perfect relationship are a number of reasons. So first of all, there's actually two proteins on the surface of flu, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and antibodies against neuraminidase can also be quite helpful and are not measured in these typical assays. So maybe you look like you don't have very good antibodies by these measurements, but maybe you have good antibodies against neuraminidase, which might protect you to some degree. Also, these assays are usually done with one or more reference viral strains. So for instance, this might be the viral strain that was in the vaccine, and they might measure how well did you make antibodies to the virus that's in the vaccine. But there's a very, very good chance that when you're actually infected, you're not going to be infected with the exact same virus that's in the vaccine. Hopefully, if Trevor and his colleagues have done their job well, you're going to be infected with a virus that's at least close to the virus in the vaccine, but they know that it's impossible to pick a single vaccine strain that represents the flu that everyone's exposed to, because there's a lot of diversity. So the best you can do is kind of get the vaccine strain in the middle of these clouds of viruses. And we unfortunately now know, even my lab has recently done some work on this, that sometimes if you just make one, even as few as one change to a virus, that could then mean that immunity works a lot less well. We found in some cases you could take someone who had very, very good immunity to the vaccine strain, just put one mutation in, and the potency of that immunity could go down tenfold or more. And it couldn't go down differently for different people, because different people's immunity will be sensitive to different mutations that the virus has. So these two reasons: first, that what we measure from serum doesn't capture everything, and second, because we're making these measurements with one or more reference viruses, and you might be infected with a virus with some mutations relative to those, mean that it's hard to say for sure what's going to happen just by making a measurement on your serum.
Great. Interesting. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, since we're on the vaccine issue, we'll talk about this and we'll get into some treatment questions. And we've got a few more questions I want to ask. So I'm curious what you guys, there's been some discussion about sort of the universal flu vaccine. Could you maybe describe a little bit about how that's been sort of thought about, and sort of what is that really, what's different, what's different about that compared to others?
So the universal flu vaccine is certainly a really important area, and I would say that the term universal flu vaccine has kind of come to mean a really wide range of efforts, I think many of which are very promising to sort of make a better flu vaccine. So in the most grandiose perspective, a universal flu vaccine would be a vaccine that you would get that would protect you for the rest of your life against all flu, not just these 4 strains that are circulating now, but also the other strains that are in birds and pigs and could potentially jump into humans in the future. And while I think that's a good goal, that's a very difficult goal, and I don't think anybody thinks that we're anywhere close to getting there. But I think in the NIH and the NIAID at the NIH has defined the exact terminology here, which I can't quite remember, but one of the goals of universal flu vaccine is simply to make a vaccine that would be a lot better. So maybe we could eventually have a vaccine that you get every couple of years or every 5 years and will protect you against the strains that circulate for those 5 years. And so there's sort of there's several different promising avenues that are being pursued in the realm of universal flu vaccines. One is that only certain parts of the virus change rapidly. So I don't know if those of you on Facebook can see me very well, but if you imagine this is the protein on the surface of the virus, this would sort of be the head of the virus, and most of the current vaccines make antibodies that bind to the head of the virus, which change a lot. And there's goals of making vaccines that cause antibodies to be produced against the stalk of the virus down here, which changes much less. So perhaps if we could engineer a vaccine that produces enough of those antibodies, that it would take much, much longer for the virus to change in a way that would affect that immunity. That's one thing that's being tried. Another goal is simply to make the vaccine elicit good antibodies against other viral proteins, such as particularly the flu neuraminidase, because we know those antibodies are important, but right now they're relatively undercharacterized and understudied. And then another goal is maybe we could just have vaccines that are really sort of inducing antibodies against similar targets to the current vaccines, but just do it much better, or sort of just better vaccine formulations. And there's lots of approaches that are being used here. There's actually the University of Washington, Neil King's and David Baker's lab have done a lot of work where they've been able to put the flu proteins on sort of these artificial proteins, and with collaborators at the NIH Vaccine Research Center, they've shown that this can induce much better or much higher levels of antibodies against flu. There are even like really exciting new approaches where people might be able to just deliver mRNA, which sort of produces the viral proteins in your body, and some of these approaches could perhaps lead to better vaccines. So all of these are ways to sort of make a better flu vaccine, and I would say, in my mind, the universal vaccine is making the vaccine better with the goal of eventually getting to one shot that would last the rest of your life. But I think we're very, very far from that goal. But I don't think we're very far from the goal of making the vaccine better than it is right now.
Great. There's a few more questions coming, so I'll get to those in a minute, but I want to give a chance to talk about treatment. Since there are at least one new agent on the market, do you want to talk a little bit about current regimens for treatment, Helen?
Sure. So for the most part, for normal, healthy individuals who have been sick for less than 2 days, we would recommend that you would start oseltamivir, also known as Tamiflu, which is a pill that you take twice a day for 5 days, and it reduces the duration of your symptoms. If you're somebody who's high risk, like you have lung disease or you're pregnant, then those people should start oseltamivir no matter how long they've had symptoms before, because we know that they tend to have virus in their body for longer periods and they can get very sick. So getting that antiviral into them and getting the full treatment course is really important in preventing serious complications from the flu. The new drug, which is what that you would like me to talk about, is baloxavir, which is also known as Xofluza. It's a drug that's currently used widely in Japan, not so much here in the United States. It's an endonuclease inhibitor, so it's the nice thing about baloxavir is that it's a pill that you just give one time, and it halves your viral load very, very quickly, and you don't have any compliance issues with it because it is just one dose. It also reduces your symptom duration. So one of the real values in baloxavir, I think, is in potentially for things like pandemics where you need to get lots of drugs into lots of people very quickly, and being able to just have one dose that you can administer to prevent spread of virus within a community would be really important. There are some clear issues that have come up with baloxavir. So right now it's licensed for adults who are both normal, healthy adults, as well as I believe last week they received FDA approval for high-risk adults as well. And you can use it in children for 12 years of age and older. But what you can't do is use baloxavir in younger children. In Japan, they are using baloxavir in younger children, and what they've found are high rates of resistance mutations that are arising in these children. That's a real concern, and that's something that we would have to be very careful about monitoring if baloxavir was used more in the United States.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's exciting to have something new, but we have to be somewhat cautious. For those of you who are immunosuppressed patients or cancer patients who are listening to this, there's a lot of resistance to use baloxavir at the moment because, as Jesse mentioned, people who develop flu or immunocompromised tend to have flu for longer periods of time despite therapy, and that the potential that they would develop early resistance to the drug is concerning. So there's been some discussion about should we be doing dual therapy and things. So I think there's going to be some further data that's coming along those lines.
That seems to be the common strategy.
Yes.
If you have evolution resistance is you have multiple agents that you use.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost like, I think everybody harkens back to the days of tuberculosis when you had one drug and you got resistance right away. We started throwing more things at it. I think it's interesting from the standpoint, a group here, Dr. Michael Book and Jan England, who's at Children's, published a paper even using some of the older agents, which are no longer even effective, that there was some suggestion that even a drug like one of the adamantanes, amantadine, in addition, even though it didn't have specific effects on the virus, in combination therapy may somehow be beneficial. So there's some situations where we think about those combination strategies. I think it's smart. From an evolutionary perspective, it sort of makes sense too. Maybe it sort of feels like it'd be a good target. Viruses are not that smart in that way, but they are also incredibly good at getting away from that one target.
Yeah, you can think of that as the viral genome is 13,000 letters, base pairs. It mutates very fast, so if you only need to change one of those letters, you can often do that. But if you have multiple drug targets that are targeting different pieces, the chances of kind of making both those mutations becomes much smaller.
And I think that's part of the reason it's so smart is because it has to get around the immune system, which has multiple different mechanisms to combat against flu. So really good points.
Right, and I think there are actually studies ongoing in immunocompromised patients of combination oseltamivir and baloxavir. So I think we'll have data very soon.
Yeah, I think it's coming. So one comment was, if you've had one robust response to Shingrix or the adjuvanted herpes zoster vaccine, would Fluad be a better choice? I don't think that's been studied specifically. So, but I think if you have had a good response and had a robust response to one, I wouldn't be surprised if you have a robust response to the next. I think whatever vaccine's available, so whether it's Fluad or the Highdose Vaccine for somebody who's 65 and older, that's probably better. One correction, I think Helen, you might have mentioned that Fluad is quadrivalent. I think it is only trivalent.
Is it?
I think it is trivalent. We'll double check that and put the comments below. Somebody mentioned that they thought that was true, and I think that's right. That's my recollection. Is there's currently no quadrivalent high dose or adjuvanted vaccine available. But good questions, everybody. I guess as we're kind of running towards the end here, I want to make sure that we've hopefully answered all questions. I'm going to do a quick check here. Let's see. I think it's a really good one to end with. There's lots of people in communities, as you're seeing. I've been very stressed about measles and all of that's been coming. There's a lot of people who are taking time to talk about what should we do with those who are not just interested in vaccinating. And I don't really like using the term anti-vaccine as much as I like to use vaccine hesitancy. And I think people are really concerned about some of the questions that have come out. There's a lot of lay press that suggests things, and people get nervous. They want to do what's right for their children and for their families. What do you guys think we should be saying to people about this? Because it is a big concern that we're starting to see less people get vaccinated. What are things that you think are important? What would be a message that you'd have people take away? Maybe Helen, why don't you start?
Right. So when I get asked this about the measles vaccine in particular, I try to focus the message on protection of the community rather than protection of the self. That really you're getting the measles vaccine to protect yourself, but also to protect those around you who cannot get vaccinated. So this would be pregnant women, the very young infants who get sick, and people with cancer, because they're the ones who are going to get sick enough that they're going to get hospitalized and die from measles. And so as an obligation to the community that you live in, you would choose to vaccinate.
I mean, I would agree with what Helen said there.
We can all agree with Helen, that's right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I also agree. It seems like this classic tragedy of the commons issue, that enough people need to be vaccinated to protect the community, and so you're doing it for yourself, but also for your neighbor.
Yeah, and I would also argue that one of the things that I think we forget is the reason we don't have a lot of these issues is because vaccines have been so effective at protecting us. The flu vaccine is not perfect, but even if you don't have a perfect response, we know that people who get vaccinated, and if you do get flu, your chances of developing life-threatening complications is substantially reduced. So what I've had people tell me is I got the flu vaccine, I got the flu, and I say, well, first of all, was it flu? And even if they did, most of them don't have major complications from that. So I think it's really important to remember that while vaccines aren't always perfect in that realm, they are incredibly valuable in protecting and saving lives. In measles, as an example, in the Congo, where Ebola's been spreading, there's been more measles deaths than Ebola deaths. So it's important to remember that vaccine-preventable diseases, it's easy to sort of say, well, I don't want to do this because there's none in our communities, but it's really important. We had a lot of measles this year, and measles has a profound effect, as does flu. So flu has a huge impact on our communities, and I really encourage, I think one take-home message from all of us is a couple things. One, get vaccinated if you can. Whatever vaccine's available, if you're older, try to get either Highdose Vaccine or flu-ad. If you're immunocompromised, talk to your physician about getting flu, and get your family members vaccinated. We want to all do this because we want to protect our community. I think it's really important, if you're sick and you think you might have flu, go get checked out, and if you are at risk, then get treated. Because treatment early can be very effective at protecting you. And then 3 is, don't be afraid to bring up conversations with people about why vaccines are important. If you're a cancer patient, or you're somebody who someone in your household or someone that's close by is at risk, be comfortable saying, I think it's important for you to get it, and here's why. I want to thank everybody for listening. I think we've addressed all the comments, but we really appreciated everybody listening. And if you have other comments, please feel free to put them below, and we'll try to get back at a later date with some of those responses. But I want to really thank Dr. Trevor Bedford, Dr. Jesse Bloom, and Dr. Helen Chu. From all of us here at Fred Hutch and UW Medicine, we really appreciate you guys listening in. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.